character sketch of Mr. Chips. Basically, we are discussing the novel Goodbye Mr. Chips, written by James Hilton. It is a story of school teacher. His name was Arthur Chipping, and the short form is Mr. Chips. He was called Mr. Chips by his students. So, first of all, I will discuss a little bit background information. Mr. Chips, by name of Arthur Chipping, fictional character, a gentle and kindly English school teacher in the novel Goodbye Mr. Chips by James Hilton. The nickname Mr. Chips was bestowed by his students. The novel is about Mr. Chips, his life as a teacher, his married life, his life after retirement, and finally his peaceful death. He is a typical character representing the class of people who uphold the tradition and convention established since long. He was a Brookfield himself. So basically, this novel is about the life of a school teacher. His name was Arthur Chipping, Mr. Chips, short form, and it is all about his life, his time in the Brookfield school. So we will further discuss the detail and character of Goodbye Mr. Chips. Early life and education. Mr. Chips was born in 1848 because its reference is given in the chapter in the novel. It is given that Mr. Chips was born, he was a toddler. Toddler means a walking boy, a little child, when there was great exhibition held. Great exhibition was held in 1850 in England. It was a scientific exhibition, a big exhibition. It was a remarkable and memorable event of 19th century. So Mr. Chips was born in 1848. He graduated from Cambridge. He joined Melbury Public School in 1869 at the age of 21. He worked there 1 year and then he left the school and tried to get job in a better school. He worked there only for 1 year and then joined Brookfield Public School in 1870. He proved his worth there. So he joined the Brookfield School 1870. Brookfield was a second grade school. It was the school of upper middle class and the middle class society of the England. So it was a grammar school, a language school. There was languages like Latin, English. These languages were taught in Brookfield at that time. So next part is Mr. Chips as a teacher. Mr. Chips was very much devoted to his profession. He was diligent and dutiful in spite of the fact that he had mediocre academic degree. He proved himself an efficient teacher. He liked his work at school and took great interest in it. He taught his classes regularly and with devotion. One day there was an air attack during the war. While Chips was taking a class, he went on teaching all through the attack. In Bridges at the age of 48 and she was 23. She brought changes in Mr. Chips. His wife died 2 years later during childbirth. So there is another character in this novel. Her name was Catherine Bridges. She was open-minded and kind-hearted lady. She met Mr. Chips during a visit to France while Mr. Chips was on his holidays, and she was also there. She was on a mountain named Great Gable, and she was waving her hand, and Mr. Chips thought that she was in trouble, and he tried to rescue her, but he fell down and broke his ankle, and she came to visit him because he was trying to save her, and then there developed a love story between them. And after after a few days, they got married. And when the Chips came back to Brookfield during the start of new session, he was married to Catherine Bridges. So Catherine Bridges was a kind lady. He bring changes in Mr. Chips' behavior and his teaching and his behavior with staff and students. Before that, Mr. Chips was a very hard traditionalist, and after that, after the marriage with Catherine, he become lenient, normal, and least strict. He become funny. He tried to tell jokes to students, and he become favorite teacher because the motivation of Catherine Bridges. But after the marriage, after 2 years of married life, she died during childbirth. Our next point is changes after marriage. Chips was very dry person before the marriage, but his marriage with Catherine, his sense of humor developed. He knew how to make pleasant jokes while teaching. He made his student laugh. This made his teaching highly interesting. Students would ask him questions with a view to having some humorous answer. So I have already told you about the behavior of Mr. Chips. Before that, he was a dry person. He was not very laughable. He was not a jolly person, funny one. But after the marriage, he became normal and lenient and funny and witty and humorous. Our next, students and all the teachers and also board of governors, which run the administrative system of the school, supported Mr. Chips, and Mr. Chips remained so. And Ralston wanted Mr. Chips to resign, but he refused. So in the end, with the support of student and board of governors, he remained at his place. Our next point is old-fashioned and conventional. Mr. Chips did not like modern trends. He did not favor modern ideas about the freedom of women. He adhered to the old customs and tradition. He never traveled under the influence of Catherine. Yet at heart, he remained a typical conservative. When Ralston asked him to retire, he refused. He also refused to change his old methods of teaching. So this describes the traditional behavior of Mr. Chips. Basically, traditionalist is a person who spend his life according to traditional and orthodox and old ideas, which are also existed before his or her life. So he follow the already made principle, not want changes and not any modern aspect he want to include in his or her life. So Mr. Chips was a traditionalist, but a good conventional traditionalist, because a conventional traditionalist always loves his country, and the love of his people, country, and his job is always in his blood and flesh. So next point is Chips' ideas toward women before and after marriage. Chips was a traditionalist, and according to tradition, women were not allowed to enjoy the equal liberties as men have. So Chips was not in the favor of women before marriage. He disliked the socialist ideas of George Bernard Shaw and philosophical ideas of Ibsen because of their liberal and rational approach toward the woman. After marriage, Chips became normal and least rigid about his behavior with women. It was Catherine who brought calmness and leniency in his personality. So there is another aspect of Mr. Chip's life, his ideas about women. Before the marriage, I have already discussed he was a traditionalist, and a traditionalist believe in old ideas. So in old time, that woman was suffering. There were no rights for them. There were a global movement for women having vote. It was called women's suffrage, global suffrage movement. In this, the woman was struggling to have a right of vote at that time. And George George Bernard Shaw was a socialist English writer. He was a writer of lower and middle classes, and he has liberal ideas. He want to change in educational system, and also in the society and in the class system. And Ibsen was a German philosopher, and his ideas was also rational. They want to give women rights, and they consider women equal. That is why Mr. Chips was not very fond of them, because they were against war, they were against the traditional convention of any country. So these writers were hated, but they are very good writers till now. They are well read writers, and their ideas are thought provoking. Okay, our next point is retirement, first and second time. Mr. Chips retired first, two time. First of all, he retired in 1913 due to his health, and but after that, after 1 year, the World War started, and they called him home. They called him, the Brookfield administration called him back to the school to teach him again, so that is why he joined again Brookfield, and after that he finally retired. He served Brookfield for a long period of 42 years. He retired in 1913, but again joined Brookfield in 1916. He finally retired from service in 1918. Memories and nostalgia. Nostalgia means the memories of the past. Chips was very imaginative person. He always lived in his thoughts about the past. He remembered his past clearly. He remembered his wife after her death, and imagined how she used to talk and sing to him. He was also very faithful, good loving husband. So the start of the novel tell us that Mr. Chips is thinking about the past. So he is an imaginative person who always thought about the past. So in whole novel, he thought about the past people, past student, and the events, and that is why this novel is also called psychological novel. Psychological mean mental. The novel which runs the novel in which the events and the ideas run in the mind of a character. So in this novel, Mr. Chips thought a lot about the past, and he was an imaginative person, but he was a good, faithful, and kind person. Post retirement and post retirement life and death. So it is our last point. And post retirement mean after retirement. After his retirement, he lived in the house of Mrs. Wickett, opposite to school, and remained in close contact with the school activities, and he died in 1933. So he died at good old ripe age. After retirement, he got boarding across the road to the Brookfield, and he started to live with the Mrs. Wickett house. So Mr. Chips always remain in contact with the students. He served students with cake and tea who visit him, and the new students. There was a student, Linford. there is an incident in the last chapter, maybe second last chapter. So he died in November 1933. So that is all about the character and the life of Mr. Chips, and I wish you best of luck for your coming year and coming study session, and try to work hard and get good marks and be successful in your life. My prayers are always with you. Best of luck.